The personal luxury coupe, a phrase that sounds like marketing nonsense today. But in 1957, it did not exist as a category at all. There was no shelf for it in the American showroom. And then one car built that shelf, stocked it, and forced every other manufacturer in Detroit to build something to put on it too. What if I told you the car that did that, the car that quietly invented an entire segment of the American auto industry, is also the same car that most collectors today walk right past at a show because they think they already know its story? They do not. Today we are talking about the Ford Thunderbird of 1961 through 1963, the generation nicknamed the Bullet Bird, and why it might be the single most underrated design chapter in Ford's entire history. But real quick before we start, comment the classic car you want us to cover next. The comment with the most likes becomes our next video. Okay, let's get into it. To understand why the Bullet Bird matters, you have to go back to 1955, when the original two-seat Thunderbird launched as Ford's answer to the Chevrolet Corvette. It sold well. It outsold the Corvette by a wide margin, in fact. But 3 years later, Ford did something that seemed almost like a betrayal to the people who loved that little two-seater. For 1958, they threw out the two-seat layout entirely and turned the Thunderbird into a four-seat car. Enthusiasts at the time were furious. Sports car people felt like Ford had abandoned the whole point of the Thunderbird. But here is the reveal nobody saw coming. That decision, the one that looked like Ford giving up on performance, was actually one of the smartest business moves in the entire history of the American auto industry. Before 1958, if you wanted a car that combined genuine luxury with a coupe body and a personal, sporting feel, your only real option was something like the Lincoln Continental Mark II, a car so expensive it was practically a custom order. The four-seat Thunderbird took that idea and made it attainable. It created, almost by accident, an entirely new market segment, the personal luxury coupe, and it worked so well that General Motors and, to a lesser extent Chrysler, spent years scrambling to build something to compete with it. Buick would not answer with the Riviera until 1963, a full 5 years after Ford had already proven the market existed. Pontiac took its own swing at the segment with the Grand Prix in 1962. In other words, Ford was not just early to this idea. Ford was years ahead of an entire industry that eventually had no choice but to follow. The success of that four-seat pivot did not just save the Thunderbird nameplate, it propelled the entire franchise forward for the next 2 decades. That second-generation Thunderbird, built from 1958 through 1960, earned itself a nickname from collectors decades later. The Squarebird. It got that name from its upright, formal, almost boxy greenhouse, the passenger cabin sitting square and proud above a body that was, frankly, a little busy underneath it. Fins. Bullet-shaped trim pieces. Scalloped body sections. Little divots pressed into the sheet metal. Hood scoops that did not always look like they belonged. Round taillights stacked in triple clusters by the end of the run. Chrome trim pieces layered on top of chrome trim pieces. And a grille that seemed to change its mind every single year about what it wanted to say. It was a design built during an era when American car stylists were still throwing every idea they had at the wall, and the Squarebird, for all its charm, genuinely looked like it. And it worked, at least commercially. 1960 was the final year of the Squarebird, and it turned out to be the best sales year the model had ever seen, with over 92,000 cars finding buyers. But here is where the story gets interesting, because success on the sales chart and confidence inside the design studio are two very different things. By the time that record-setting 1960 model year wrapped up, Ford's own designers already knew the Squarebird's look had run its course. The fins, the scallops, the busy surfacing, all of it belonged to a design language that was aging out in real time. A full redesign was not just planned. It was necessary. So Ford handed the project to a designer named Bill Boyer, and what came out of his studio for 1961 was, without exaggeration, one of the cleanest, most confident shifts in design philosophy that any American car had undergone in a single generational change. Where the Squarebird was busy, the new Thunderbird was calm. Where the Squarebird stacked ornament on top of ornament, the new car stripped almost all of it away. Ford called this new shape something that stuck instantly with the public and with collectors ever since. the Bullet Bird. Now here is where I want to slow down, because the design language of this car deserves real attention, and it almost never gets it. Most people look at a 1961 to 1963 Thunderbird and just see, well, an old car with a pointy front end. What they are missing is one of the most disciplined surfacing jobs to come out of Detroit in that entire era. The signature move of the Bullet Bird is a single continuous convex curve, low on the body side, running the full length of the car from headlight to taillight. Designers call this a low-frequency crown, and the phrase is a mouthful, but the idea is simple. Instead of breaking the body side up with creases and character lines the way most cars of the era did, Ford stylists let one smooth, barrel-like surface do all the work. That barrel shape gets echoed again on the hood, which carries a subtle power bulge and a wrap-down curve that makes the engine underneath feel tightly cowled, almost like the nose of a jet. And speaking of that nose, here is a detail that genuinely sets this car apart from almost anything else built in Detroit during this period. The front bumper on the Bullet Bird is not a separate chrome bar bolted onto the front of the car the way it was on virtually every other American automobile of the era. It is fully integrated into the grille and the front-end styling, blended so completely that the whole nose reads as one continuous sculptural piece rather than body panel plus bumper plus grille as three separate afterthoughts. Now, I have to be honest with you here, because this is not a story about a car that got everything right. That integrated bumper looked fantastic. It also offered essentially no real crash protection. It was there purely for style, and if you tapped a wall with it, you were not walking away with a clean bill of health for your front end. But visually, it was ahead of its time by years. Look lower on the body, along the rocker panel just beneath the doors, and you will notice another quiet trick. Ford's designers tucked that lower panel sharply inward, which has the visual effect of lowering how tall the whole car appears to sit, even though the actual sheet metal dimensions did not change. And if you trace that low-frequency crown all the way back toward the rear quarter, you will find one more small detail easy to miss at a glance. A subtle ridge rising just above the body side that forms a tiny fin shape right where the rear fender kicks up. It is a restrained nod to the fin-obsessed era this car was leaving behind, present just enough to acknowledge the trend without ever letting it take over the design the way it had on the Squarebird, or on nearly everything General Motors was building at the time. Outside of that ridge, the wheel lips, and the skirted rear wheel opening, the body side is almost entirely free of feature lines, which is precisely what makes that single crown surface so effective. There is nothing else competing with it for your eye. Step inside the cabin, and the same restrained confidence carries through. Ford gave the Bullet Bird a dual cockpit interior theme, with a center console running between the front bucket seats that visually separated the driver's side from the passenger's side, each with its own instrument-style trim. Bright work from the dashboard flowed directly into the door panels and down into that center console, tying the whole cabin together as one continuous design statement rather than a collection of separate parts bolted to a bench. It was a genuinely upscale, driver-focused layout, years before bucket seats and center consoles became a common sight in mainstream American cars. There is another design choice on this car that quietly breaks one of the oldest rules in automotive styling. Look at almost any American car from this era, and you will notice the belt line, that horizontal line where the body meets the greenhouse, typically rises as it moves toward the back of the car. It is a visual trick designers use to suggest forward motion, like the car is leaning into a sprint even while parked. The Bullet Bird does the opposite. Its belt line actually dives downward toward the rear. It is a small detail, but it completely changes the emotional read of the car. Instead of looking like it is about to launch forward, it looks composed, settled, elegant, rather than aggressive. That word, elegant, is really the whole story of this design. While most of Detroit in the early 1960s was chasing motion, speed, and aggression in their sheet metal, the Bullet Bird stylists chased calm. And nowhere is that contrast more obvious than when you put this car next to its most famous rival from the same era, 1961 Cadillacs. With their sharp tail fins and dramatic ornamentation, represent almost the exact philosophical opposite of what Ford was doing with the Thunderbird. One car shouts. The other one, quite deliberately, does not. The details reinforce that theme everywhere you look. Round taillights, styled to look like jet exhaust ports. Bright work finished in a soft, pot metal sheen rather than blinding polished chrome. A rear deck lid kept completely flat and simple, with no center divot interrupting its surface. This was full-blown jet-age design thinking, but restrained jet-age design thinking, which in the context of 1961, Detroit made it almost radical. And the Bulletbird did not just borrow this restraint out of nowhere. If you look closely, you can trace some of its design roots back to a Ford dream car from 1953 called the X100, and forward to the 1961 Lincoln Continental, which shared some glass and interior structure with the Thunderbird behind the scenes. Two very different cars, wearing related bones under very different skin. The 1961 model year introduced this new shape to the public for the first time, and it launched with real momentum behind it. The car paced the Indianapolis 500 that year. It rolled through President John F. Kennedy's inaugural parade. And under the hood, Ford gave the new Thunderbird a completely new engine, a 390 cubic inch V8, making 300 horsepower, the only engine offered that year, mated exclusively to a 3-speed Cruise-O-Matic automatic transmission. Manual transmissions were gone from the options sheet entirely. This was a car built for effortless cruising, not shifting your own gears. But the single most talked about feature of that first Bulletbird year was not the engine, it was a steering wheel. Ford introduced something called the swing-away steering wheel as a $25.10 option. Here is how it worked, and it is worth explaining because it genuinely impressed people at the time. With the transmission shifted into park, the entire steering column and wheel would slide roughly 18 inches to the right, out of the driver's way, making it dramatically easier to get in and out of the car. You could even start the engine with the wheel swung over to the side, though for safety, the transmission would stay locked in park until the column was moved back into driving position. It sounds like a small parlor trick today, but in 1961, it felt like something out of the future, and buyers loved it enough that Ford made it standard equipment the very next year. Sales for that first Bulletbird year landed at a little over 73,000 cars, a step down from the Squarebird's record-setting final season, but still a strong number for a brand-new design finding its footing. And this is where the story could have just settled into a comfortable, predictable pattern. New shape, modest changes each year, gradual fade. Except that is not what happened. Because 1962 is where this car actually got interesting. If you ask serious Thunderbird collectors which year of the Bulletbird represents the design at its absolute best, the answer, more often than not, is 1962. And once you understand what changed, you will probably agree with them. The grille switched from the 1961's finer mesh texture to a bolder egg crate pattern, giving the front end a bit more presence without disrupting the calm of the overall shape. But the real improvement was on the hood. Remember those feature lines flanking the hood scoop on the 1961 car? For 1962, Ford's designers removed them entirely, leaving one smooth, uninterrupted surface running back from the nose. It sounds like a minor tweak. In person, it is the difference between a shape that is almost perfect and a shape that actually is. The rear brightwork also changed, now arranged in 3 separate pieces just behind the rear wheel, paired with taillights that picked up more 3-dimensional sculpting, a recessed outer ring wrapped around a protruding center section that caught light beautifully at night. 1962 also brought 2 entirely new body variants into the lineup, and both are worth knowing about if you are ever shopping this generation. The first was the Landau hardtop, which came with a standard vinyl roof covering, styled to evoke old-fashioned formal carriages, paired with simulated walnut trim inside the cabin. The second, and by far the more famous of the two, was the Sports Roadster. Here is the story behind that one, because it is a great example of Ford listening to its own customers. Some Thunderbird convertible owners had been having dealers install a removable fiberglass tonneau cover over the rear seat area, essentially disguising the 4-seat convertible as a sleek 2-seat roadster, complete with a headrest fairing built directly behind the front seats. The demand for that look was strong enough that Ford decided to offer it as a genuine factory option for 1962, bundled together with a passenger grab bar and a set of dazzling 48-spoke Kelsey Hayes chrome wire wheels with knockoff centers. It was not cheap. The package added about $650 over the price of a standard convertible, and as a result, production stayed limited. Ford built 1,427 sports roadsters for 1962, out of a total Thunderbird production run for the year that landed right around 78,000 cars. A base 1962 Thunderbird carried a sticker price of $5,439, which was genuinely expensive money for the era, roughly double what a full-sized Chevrolet sedan would cost you. And under the hood, this is where the story gets genuinely rare, in a way that most people who are not deep into Thunderbird history have never even heard of. The standard engine for 1962 remained that same 390 cubic inch V8, rated at 300 horsepower through a single 4-barrel carburetor. But for buyers who wanted more, Ford quietly introduced something special, an optional version of that same 390 cubic inch block, breathing through not one, but 3 2-barrel Holley carburetors stacked together on a special intake manifold, paired with a slightly more aggressive camshaft. Ford's factory literature rated this tri-power engine at 340 horsepower, and enthusiasts came to know it by its factory order code, the M code. Mechanically, that tri-power setup worked a little differently than people sometimes assume. It was not 3 carburetors all dumping fuel into the engine at once from idle. The center carburetor handled every day, part throttle driving on its own, keeping fuel economy and drivability reasonable around town. Only when the driver pushed well into the throttle did the 2 outer carburetors open up and join in, unlocking the engine's full output all at once. It was a setup designed to let a Thunderbird owner drive gently through traffic all week, and then, on the rare occasion they actually put their foot down, feel a genuine second wind kick in. Now here is the number that should stop you in your tracks. Out of a Thunderbird production run of roughly 78,000 cars for 1962, Ford only sold 145 of these M-code tri-power engines. 145 out of 78,000. That is not a rare option. That is practically a rounding error. Buyers were not exactly lining up to check that box, because Thunderbird customers in this era, generally speaking, were not cross-shopping against muscle cars. They wanted the swing-away steering wheel, and the wire wheels, and the walnut trim. They were not asking their salesmen about camshaft profiles. But for the small handful who did want it, Ford gave them one of the rarest engines to ever leave a Ford assembly line in this entire period, hiding in plain sight under the hood of what most people assumed was simply a boulevard cruiser. If you are a collector today, chasing an original, documented, matching numbers M-code Thunderbird, you are hunting for one of maybe a few dozen surviving examples out of that original 145, scattered across the entire country, more than 6 decades after they left the factory. That is a rarer find than plenty of engines that get far more attention in car culture. And here is the part of this story that genuinely surprises people. Despite that kind of rarity, despite the styling being widely regarded by collectors as the purest expression of the entire Bulletbird design, a well-restored, solid driver quality standard 1962 Thunderbird can still often be found for somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000. Recent public auction results for standard 1962 Thunderbirds have landed anywhere from around $18,500 up toward $24,000 for excellent condition cars, numbers that would barely buy you a basic used sedan off a modern dealer lot. For a hand-assembled, jet-age-styled coupe that helped define an entire category of American automobile. Compare that to what collectors pay for equivalent-era Cadillacs, Buick Rivieras, or Chrysler letter cars with a similar design pedigree, and the Thunderbird, particularly this 1962 model year, still looks like one of the more undervalued corners of the entire classic American car market. It is not that nobody appreciates this generation. It is that the appreciation has never quite translated into the kind of auction premiums you would expect for a car this historically important, this well-engineered, and, in its rarest configuration, this genuinely scarce. So if 1962 really was the high point, the natural question is, what happened next? And this is where the story takes a turn that a lot of Bulletbird fans genuinely wish had gone differently. 1963 was, on the surface, a fairly minor update. Ford kept the smoothed-out hood from the previous year, no complaints there. The grille switched again, this time to a vertical bar texture that looked fine on its own terms. Mechanically, the car actually got measurably better. Ford improved the braking system, introduced power door locks as an option for the very first time on the Thunderbird, and swapped the old generator for a modern alternator, a genuinely useful upgrade for anyone who actually drove the car regularly rather than trailering it to shows. But then there is the one change that collectors still bring up, decades later, as the moment the design lost something, it never quite got back. For 1963, Ford's stylists added a new feature line along the body side, a crease running from the front fender back into the door. On paper, that sounds like nothing, a single crease. In practice, it broke the single most important thing about the entire Bulletbird design language, that continuous, uninterrupted, low-frequency crown running the full length of the car. The whole point of this shape, from the very beginning, had been calm, unbroken surfacing. And in 1963, Ford cut right through it. The ripple effects went further than just that one crease. Because the new line ran directly through the space where the Thunderbird script badge used to sit, Ford had to relocate that badge back to the rear quarter panel. The rear brightwork, which had been arranged just behind the rear wheel since 1962, moved forward into the door area to work around the new crease. A small grille guard was added down low, integrated into the bumper. None of these were bad ideas in isolation. But stacked together, they represented Ford quietly walking back from the design philosophy that had made this generation special in the first place. Production numbers for 1963 tell part of that story too. The beloved sports roadster package, which had found 1,427 buyers in its debut year, collapsed to just 455 units for 1963, and the ultra-rare M-Code tri-power engine became rarer still, with only 55 sold across the entire model year, down from 145 the year before. Some of that drop reflects a Thunderbird lineup that was simply aging toward the end of its 3-year cycle, with a fully redesigned fourth generation already waiting in the wings for 1964. But some of it also reflects buyers responding, whether consciously or not, to a design that had lost a bit of the confidence that made 1961 and 1962 so compelling. None of this makes the 1963 Thunderbird a bad car. It is still, by any reasonable measure, a striking, well-built, genuinely advanced automobile for its era, and it still wears almost all of the jet-age design language that makes this generation so distinctive. But ask most serious collectors to rank the 3 years of the Bulletbird, and 1963 almost always lands in third place, not because Ford got worse at building cars, but because Ford's designers, for one single model year, second-guessed a shape they had already gotten right. Production of this entire third generation wrapped up in July of 1963, after which Ford moved on to a completely redesigned, more squared-off fourth-generation Thunderbird for 1964. A car that, interestingly, brought back a center divot on the deck lid, the very detail the Bulletbird had deliberately removed. Different era, different philosophy. The moment had passed. So here is where this story lands. In an era when American car design was dominated by fins, chrome, and barely restrained aggression, a small team of Ford stylists working under Bill Boyer built something genuinely different, a shape defined by restraint, by a single continuous surface running the length of the car, by elegance chosen deliberately over motion. They got it almost entirely right in 1961. They perfected it in 1962. And then, in 1963, they second-guessed themselves just enough to blur the picture, right before handing the whole design over to history. More than 6 decades later, the market still has not fully caught up to what this generation actually represents. A design chapter influential enough to help define an entire category of American car, technically sophisticated enough to hide one of the rarest tri-power V8 engines Ford ever built in low-volume production, and still, even today, affordable enough that a genuinely excellent example can be parked in your driveway for less money than a new economy car. That combination, historical significance paired with real-world affordability, is rare in the classic car world. Most cars that matter this much cost a great deal more to own, and most cars that cost this little do not come with a story anywhere near as rich as this one. If you ever find yourself standing in front of a 1962 Ford Thunderbird at a car show, take a slow walk around the body side before you look at anything else. Follow that single curve from headlight to taillight with your eyes. That is not an accident. That is a design team that understood exactly what they were doing, working in an industry that, most of the time, was screaming for attention. The Bullet Bird chose to whisper instead, and frankly, more than 60 years on, it still deserves a much louder round of applause than it usually gets. What is the most underrated classic car of the 1960s in your opinion? Drop it in the comments below. Tell us which model year you would actually want to own, and thanks for watching.